So in this episode, I want to do a deep dive into our client Conor's journey from having an ACL rupture, 2 meniscus tears and an ankle fracture and dislocation to running his first ever half marathon pain-free. I want to pick apart the exact assessment that we used with Conor, I want to show you the findings from that assessment, and I want to show you the exact pathway that we took to get him from this place of pain to pain-free and performing even better than he was before. So Conor came to us in August, and at that point he was complaining of his body just being filled with niggles. He was having persistent lower body aches and pains. His ankle was sore, his Achilles was playing up, his knee was niggly, and he felt like he was forever getting hamstring strains every time he ran. By this point, Conor had actually stepped away from cricket because there was no longer enjoyment in the game because he kept getting injured, and he felt like every single time he pushed himself on cricket, the next day he was left riddled with aches and pains. Conor's exercise in life was essentially ruled by how his body was feeling. When we asked Conor why he wanted to start working with us in pain to performance, he said these two things. He wanted to be in a place where he could actually wake up in the morning just feeling pain-free and ready to go for the day, and to be in a place that he could actually push himself and make himself more healthy and make himself fitter. His ultimate goal with us was to be completely pain-free and playing sport freely again. That word freely is something that we hear a lot in pain to performance, that freedom around exercise and around sport, being able to push your body to limits that you didn't really think were possible because of your injuries, and Conor felt just like that. To be quite honest, running long distances wasn't even on Conor's radar at this point. This wasn't really even something that he thought would be attainable or thought would be possible, so he hadn't even considered it as a goal. And we see this a lot because for people who have constantly been plagued with injuries and pains, setting scary goals aren't exciting. Setting scary goals are just scary because they just feel like they're unachievable, and you just get caught in this rut of not being able to achieve exactly what you want simply because of your body, not because you're in a motivation, not because of your time, because your body's letting you down over and over again. And it sort of takes the enjoyment out of setting those bigger goals. So just to give you a bit of a history with Conor's injuries, because I know I listed a few of them at the start, that was only a few. Conor's injuries really kicked off around 2019, where he had his first ACL tear. So he had an ACL rupture at this point. Then in 2020, he tore his meniscus. In 2020, he had an ACL reconstruction with a meniscal repair in the same surgery. Then in 2021, he re-tore his meniscus. And in 2021, he then had his meniscus removed in another surgery. And then in 2023, he broke his ankle and dislocated his ankle, which led to another surgery, as I said, with lots of metal work and repair in there. And that list doesn't even mention the sort of less serious injuries that Conor was also having at this time. The niggles that he was having in his Achilles with Achilles tendinopathy, the problems that he was having with his groin and with his hamstrings, repetitive tendon strains and tears, and also the just overall tightness that he felt in his body at that time. So the big question is, what were we going to do about this? We had a list of injuries, we had the symptoms at the current time. The next thing we needed to look at was a little bit more around his assessment. Conor had physiotherapy from 2019 right through to 2023, on and off, pre and post surgery for different issues along the way. But nothing that he was doing was ever truly getting into a point where he was able to play his sport freely like he wanted to, and to wake up in the mornings feeling pain-free. So the first thing we did was get Conor's initial assessment and got him to complete his baseline movement and strength assessment. All of this happened inside our app, and we got all the data that we needed then from Conor to review. When we received this, we were able to do a bit of a deep dive into the findings and looking at these findings through the lens of his current symptoms. And this is really, really important. We weren't just looking at Conor and not matching up to his symptoms. We were taking into account how he was feeling. We were taking into account his history with physio before, and we were putting on those glasses and looking at it through the lens of his symptoms. And this is what we gathered. What you'll see on the screen here is Conor's 20% rule. So on the left is what we're looking for with most people by the time they finish the stabilised phase inside pain to performance. We're wanting everything to be at an equilibrium. We want everything to be doing its job, nothing to be overloaded. This means that we're going to have a really nice efficient running pattern. It means that we're going to be absorbing force and reducing force from the ground in a really efficient way and not putting ourselves at risk of injury. When we looked at Conor on his initial assessment, we could see that there were gaps missing. So what you can see here is his foot and ankle and his calf wasn't quite doing its job. So we'd marked it down to 5%. He wasn't able to get into the ranges required to tolerate load, and he wasn't able to tolerate load even in the ranges that he did have. Moving up to his hamstring, we could see there that there was repeated weakness in his hamstrings across all tests, and he really struggled to lengthen his hamstrings as well. There was an awful lot of tightness in those muscles, particularly coming up into the proximal hamstrings where it begins to meet the glute. Coming into the front of his hip, he was pretty good. He had pretty good strength through his hip flexor and through his groin. Potentially these areas actually have been overloaded in the past, hence the maximal strength. There was a lot of tightness in the muscles, but they were able to hold a lot of the loads. And then coming down the front of the leg into the quad, there was significant weakness there. And this is quite interesting because Conor had done a lot of rehab with squats and lunges and different things in the past, and yet that was still not quite taking the load that we would require for running. And what this ended up doing then is leaving Conor with an excess load of 60%. So there was an excess load floating around, if you like, of 60%. So every single time Conor was playing cricket or going for a run and his foot struck the ground, there was an excess load of 60% going up into that body. And it doesn't just sit there and get spat back out, it has to be absorbed. And for Conor, this was getting absorbed in different areas. Sometimes it was his Achilles, so there was too much load going onto the foot and ankle. Sometimes his load was going straight up into his knee. Other times it was going on to excess load into his hip and he was getting groin niggles. And sometimes it was going into his hamstring, which was not prepared for those loads at all, and that's where he would have ended up with his hamstring tears and his hamstring tendinopathies. From a movement perspective, Conor didn't move too badly, but there was two planes of movement that we did see a few issues in. First one was in his frontal plane, so shifting from side to side. Conor didn't like to load into his lateral hip. Or another way of saying that is that Conor didn't like shifting his hips outside of his base of support. This is an indication that yes, his hips might be strong in a shortened position, but they didn't like moving dynamically, which is really, really important for things like sport if you think about changing direction or sort of swaying outside of your base of support. In his toe touch, he really struggled to shift his weight forward. He liked to hold his weight back in his heels. He didn't seem very confident on his midfoot, and he didn't have a good ability to tolerate load through his posterior chain, nor did he have a good ability to lengthen through his glutes and his hamstrings. And all of these things, like poor co-contractions through his posterior chain, inability to lengthen certain muscle groups, and inability to tolerate himself going outside of his base of support, are key sort of red flag issues that we're looking at thinking, no wonder he's picking up niggles left, right and centre. We need to work on those key skills first and then build him up to his level of sport. So that's what I want to talk about next, which is what did we do? So we've got his assessment findings. We've figured out, okay, this is where or why his body's been overloaded in certain places. Instead of just fixating on the symptoms themselves, so instead of looking at Conor's knee and thinking, right, how can we make that knee pain-free with things like manual therapy, or looking at the hamstring and thinking, right, let's give him loads of hamstring stretches because that's going to help to lengthen the area. We didn't actually look at that. What we did is we looked at the weaker areas around those areas, built up their strengths so that then the areas that we're getting overcompensated on become uncompensated, if you like. We have a whole video on the 20% rule. I think we did it in episode 1. You can go back and watch that if you want a little bit more detail on what I'm meaning whenever I say all of those words around compensation. But the most important thing to realise here is that we weren't fixating on Conor's symptoms. We were actually looking at the bigger picture and figuring out why did those symptoms start in the first place. So once we had established that, we knew what we needed to strengthen, but that wasn't enough. We now started to need to look through the lens of Conor's goals. So Conor's goals was to get back to running, obviously in a straight line, but also get back to things like cricket, so change direction as well with his running. So what we did is we took his goal of cricket and we took his goal of running and we broke it down into digestible chunks. We broke it down into skills, and then we ordered those skills in sort of level of intensity. And we could group those skills into phase 1 and phase 2 and phase 3 and so on, right up until the point where he got to his goal. And this is what we do inside the stabilised phase for our clients. The stabilised phase is taking people from pain to pain-free. So as I said, we look at that goal. How can he play a cricket match pain-free? That was one of the things he wanted to do. Or how could he run just a simple 3K pain-free? And we take that and we break it down into those digestible chunks and those milestones, and we make sure that we tick each of those off along the way, making sure that every single week, every single month, he's moving in the right direction and he can see the progress that he's making. Alongside that stabilised phase, we'll be having little tests along the way to make sure that his baseline assessment has been completed, make sure that we've worked on those baseline foundational sort of tests to begin with, and then we do his next stage of his testing, which is his functional movement testing, and then we're working it up to his capacity and endurance testing before we then go on to his gold standard testing. So there's different testing along the way as well to make sure that we're not just going off subjective measures, but also objective measures. And for Conor, he moved along this quite nicely. There was a little bit of a sticking point when it came to loading up his soleus around his ankle. This is usually because he's had the surgery around the ankle, quite a significant surgery, so he was physically restricted into certain ranges, meaning that we had to adapt some exercises to make sure that he was able to fire up his soleus in the range that was comfortable for him. But once he got that, and once we acknowledged that that was going to be something that was going to continue to be tricky, we made sure to keep in some soleus exercises even as he progressed up to the higher levels. So for Conor, the key skills that we were working on based off his initial assessment was shifting his hips outside of his base of support. We had to do this at a really low level to begin with before we could build him up to a high level, like his change of direction plyometrics. So that was one skill that we were looking at the whole way through. Another skill that we were looking at is his ability to create co-contractions from his midfoot in a sort of static stance position, and then being able to do that at a really high level, again through his plyometrics in a straight line direction for things like running. So co-contractions is whenever we couple and we coordinate and we contract muscles all together. So for him, we were trying to contract his calf and his hamstring and his quad all together through the use of his midfoot. So being able to get good foot intent was really important, and getting those muscles to contract in the way we want. And then the sort of follow on from that, which is sort of the biggest skill, or sort of the last skill I suppose that we were working on with Conor, which was his ability to extend his hip before his knee. Conor Conor had an awful habit of straightening his knees and slapping his knees back, shortening his quads. He didn't like to lengthen his quads, he didn't like to extend his hip, and this was something which is so important for running. That ability to strike the ground with the midfoot, keep a bend in the knee and extend the hip over the top of the knee is a really important skill that a lot of people can't do, and therefore they pick up injuries whenever they are running. So this was something that we were working on at a really low level, again with things like our foam roller bridges, and then we were taking that right up to the gym level with his RDLs and his deadlifts, and making sure that when he was training in the gym, he wasn't out training the skills that we've just been working on. So all the hard work he did in the lower levels, when he got into his higher level rehab, then he was able to really put these into practice in the gym and in his plyometrics, which then eventually got him to his running and to his cricket. What we did differently with Conor that other physios hadn't done with him before, and hence why we got the results that we did, is that we didn't just fixate ourselves on the pain that he was having in that moment, and we also made sure that his plan was progressive. When we asked Conor about his old rehab, yeah, he got up to the standing level, yes, he had worked through movements like squats, but none of them were based on good foundations. The foundations phase had sort of been skipped. They jumped right in at this sort of body weight level, but then he was never progressed up to the weighted level. It all felt quite sporadic, just reaching for random exercises and sort of throwing them at him, leaving him for a few weeks and then coming back and sort of checking in when something didn't work. They just changed sort of what line they were going down and they gave him different exercises, or maybe they targeted just one specific area like his lateral hip by giving him things like clams and things like that, but didn't actually couple that lateral hip up with how his foot was moving as well and what that would actually look like when you put him into sport or onto the roads for running. So once Conor was at a place where he was pain-free, he had completed the stabilised phase, the next phase he was going to move into then was the build phase. And the build phase is all about making sure that this injury does not come back. And that is so important for people because this is where we build confidence. It's all well and good being pain-free, and don't get me wrong, when people come to us, that's all they want to do. But once they get to that point, they don't want to lose that. They want to make sure that they are robust, that they are resilient, and that they are at as low a risk of injury as possible. So for Conor, a lot of this phase was all about a progressive return to running. It was about moving him through his next phase of his plyometrics, and it was about building a good routine around strength training, functional strength training. And this is where accountability really came in for Conor. When Conor was in the stabilised phase, he was sending us videos left, right and centre. We were getting loads of feedback. We didn't really need to be on him and hold him accountable. But establishing a routine around strength training and running can be really tricky when life gets busy. So accountability was really important in this phase, making sure that he was keeping a nice consistent routine, keeping up with his form, keeping up with his exercise videos and getting all the feedback that he needed. So as Conor worked through sort of his first phase, which took him through from a 5k plan into a 10k plan, he then completed Lisburn 10k pain-free, and by that point he had already made sure that his strength training was complementing his running as well. And then this is when Conor expressed an interest in wanting to run a half marathon, and it was really important at this stage that we made sure that he had the adequate strength that he needed. So this is where we put him through his barbell testing and his capacity endurance testing, and we made sure that he was robust and strong enough to partake in a half marathon and to go through that plan. It was at this point that we started talking to Conor as well about cadence, which was really important, because cadence is something that a lot of people overlook, and it's a really simple thing that can mean that a lot of people have injuries when they run. If their cadence is too low, they're not going to have nice efficient running patterns, they're not going to have good co-contractions, they're not going to have ability to absorb force and produce force efficiently, and they end up with injury. So for Conor, it was really important that we told him that he needed to keep his cadence up at 180 and that he had to work on that as he worked through this plan. And then this is where you could essentially say that Conor progressed from the build phase into the perform phase, and this is where you really start chasing those big goals, and this is where Conor started to work his way through his half marathon plan and achieve his half marathon pain-free. So Conor's story is a massive success story of how someone can go from a really sort of traumatic run of injuries from 2019 right up to 2023 and still be able to achieve those big, scary goals. And I hope from Conor's journey you can be inspired. And I think the really important thing for you to acknowledge and understand from Conor's journey is that progress can be made. Right now you might feel like you're a wee bit stuck. Right now you might not have the right answers. You might not be on the right track. But Conor was in the exact same place literally last August. A year ago from now, Conor was in that exact same place. And now he's able to run, he's able to train, he's able to play cricket, and he's able to play sport freely just like he wanted. He no longer wakes up in the morning feeling achy and stiff, and he's able to do double days if he wants to and if his life is busy. Getting to the root cause of your injury is absolutely key, not just looking at the symptoms, making sure that you're doing that deep dive, that you're understanding why have those symptoms come about in the first place. And the second thing that's really important is making sure that you understand the skills required for your goal. There's no point working through a plan that isn't taking you to your goal. And then the third thing is making sure that you've got a phased approach that doesn't just get you pain-free, but it also makes you robust and strong, and it also supports you as you go to achieve those bigger goals. And at Pain to Performance, that is exactly what we do. And on Monday the 25th of August, we actually have a special offer going out specifically for 3 runners who are currently running with knee pain and who want to run pain-free and regain the confidence and durability in their knees. We are going to work with you on our 90-day Pain to Performance pathway, taking you from a place of pain to pain-free and feeling more robust than ever in your knees. During our 90 days, you're not going to have to worry about your knee flaring up after runs. You're not going to have to spend hours doing random rehab exercises that don't have any meaning. And you're not going to have to sacrifice your routine or give up running completely. You're going to get a personalised rehab plan that is designed to eliminate your knee pain and get you running stronger. You're also going to get step-by-step guidance that fits around you and your busy schedule with no overwhelm. And of course, you're going to get support and accountability along the way to make sure that you're progressing every single week. So if you're currently running with knee pain and you think this opportunity would be good for you, just drop me a message on Instagram with the word interested and we'll send you over all the details. But I hope you found this enjoyable listening to Conor's journey, and I hope that you've been inspired that you too can get rid of your knee pain and get back to running pain-free.